The old man's hands didn't shake when he reached for the door handle. That was the first thing worth knowing about Harold Mercer. He was 78 years old, and he moved the way old trees move in wind, slowly, deliberately, like something that had already survived every storm worth naming. He wore a canvas jacket the color of dried moss, the kind you find at army surplus stores, the kind that smells faintly of diesel and wood smoke no matter how many times you wash it. His boots were steel-toed and worn down at the outer heel, the left one more than the right. He walked with a slight lean, the result of a piece of shrapnel that had been sitting in his left hip since 1968, in a rice paddy outside a small village that no longer existed on any map. He wasn't thinking about any of that when he pushed open the door to Ridgemont Arms and Supply on the second Tuesday of November. He was thinking about the drive home from his daughter's place in Barry. She'd started locking the screen door at night. She'd asked him about it, gently, the way she always did when she wanted something she thought he'd refuse. "You're not as young as you were, Dad." He hadn't argued. He'd driven back to his house in Collingwood in silence, stopped at the Tim Hortons on the edge of town, drank his double-double alone at a corner table, and decided. He wanted something for beside the bed, something real. Ridgemont Arms sat at the end of a strip mall on AW26, wedged between a physiotherapy clinic and an insurance broker. The sign out front was hand-painted green and gold. Inside, the store smelled of gun oils and cedar, and the glass display cases ran in a long L shape from the front door all the way to the back wall. There were 3 young men working that afternoon. The one nearest the door was named Brandon Kwok, 23, 6 months on the job, still learning. He was sorting ammunition boxes when Harold Mercer walked in and didn't look up right away. The second one, Kyle Arsenault, was behind the long counter near the middle of the store. Kyle was 26, broad-shouldered, with a loud laugh he used often, and for purposes unrelated to anything genuinely funny. He'd been selling at Ridgemont for 2 years, and had developed the particular confidence of someone who knew slightly more than the people he was supposed to be serving, and had decided that made him an authority. The third, Jamie Delisle, was on a stepladder near the back, restocking boxes on a high shelf. He was the quietest of the 3, and it would be worth remembering that detail later. Harold walked to the main counter and stood in front of the display case. He looked down at the handguns laid out on the felt. He wasn't in a hurry. Kyle noticed him after a moment and walked over, but didn't fully cross the counter to greet him. He stopped a few feet short, the way you stop when you've already decided the conversation isn't going to take long. "Help you with something?" "I'm looking for a home defense pistol," Harold said. "Something I can manage at the bedside. Don't need anything fancy." Kyle looked at him, at the canvas jacket, at the slow way Harold had moved to the counter, that hip-lean gait. He glanced over at Brandon, and something passed between them, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "Home defense," Kyle said, pulling the word out slightly. "Okay, and, just so I can point you in the right direction, how long has it been since you handled a firearm?" "A while," Harold said. "Right." Kyle put both hands on the glass. "I ask because, no offense, sir, some of our customers at a certain age find the weight's a bigger issue than they expect. Recoil especially. A 9mm, for example. The grip size alone can be." "I'm not worried about grip size," Harold said. Kyle smiled, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "What I'm saying is, for a gentleman in your position, you might want to consider one of the smaller options. The Ruger LCP, something like that. Light, simple, less to manage." Brandon had drifted over by then, pretending to reorganize something in the adjacent case. "Or honestly," Kyle continued, "have you thought about one of those monitored alarm systems? I know it's not what you came in for, but for a single resident home." "I didn't ask about alarm systems." "No, I know. I just... At your age, sir, the liability considerations." Harold Mercer looked at him. He didn't look away. He didn't shift his weight or adjust his collar or do any of the small things people do when they want to signal they've been diminished. He just looked at Kyle Arsenault with eyes the color of a lake in October, flat and grey and deep, and he said nothing. That should have been the end of it. In a better world, it would have been. But Kyle was 26 and had a second audience now. Brandon was watching, and somewhere in the back, Jamie had stopped moving on his stepladder. "I'm just trying to save you some trouble," Kyle said. "These things are not toys. A misfire in a home setting, especially if your reaction time is, at 70-75, the average person." "I'm 78. "Right. Exactly. So what I'd suggest..." "I'd like to see the C-75, Harold said. A pause. Kyle reached under the counter and brought out the pistol, set it on the cloth pad on top of the case. Harold picked it up with his right hand. He checked the chamber, clear, then rotated it once, feeling the balance, his thumb finding the safety without searching for it. He looked down the sight line, adjusted his grip by 2 millimeters, and set it back down. The whole thing took 11 seconds. Kyle stared at him. "It's a fine pistol," Harold said, "but heavier than I need. Do you have the SP-01 Phantom?" Kyle had not expected that question. He didn't have an immediate answer, which was unusual enough that Brandon stopped pretending to work and just looked at the old man directly. "We might have one in the back," Kyle said, recovering. "But I want to be honest with you, the trigger pull on that model is £7 factory, I know." Another pause. Longer this time. Let me check what we have." Kyle disappeared into the back room. Brandon leaned against the counter. He was younger and a bit less certain about what he'd just witnessed, but he'd been following Kyle's lead all afternoon, and old habits. "You know your stuff," Brandon said. It was meant to sound like a compliment. It came out sounding like surprise, which wasn't the same thing. Harold said nothing. "My grandpa was into guns," Brandon offered. "He had a collection. Old stuff, mostly. Bolt actions, that kind of thing." He paused. "He passed last spring." Harold looked at him. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Yeah." Brandon looked down. "Then, how long you been shooting? Long enough." From the top of his stepladder, Jamie's watched all of this and said nothing. Kyle came back with a plastic case and set it on the counter. Inside, nested in foam, was a CZ SP-01 Phantom. Grey frame, steel slide, used but well maintained. Harold looked at it but didn't reach for it yet. "How long has this one been in?" he asked. "Couple months." "Trade-in, previous owner's service record on the slide?" Kyle blinked. We don't typically. There are pressure marks on the right side of the frame, just above the trigger guard. That's from holster carry, not range use, specific angle. Duty holster, most likely." Harold looked up at him. "I want to know how it was used before it was sold." Kyle had no answer for that. He picked up the case, turned it over, checked the paperwork inside. "I'd have to pull the records. I'd appreciate that." Kyle went to the computer behind the counter. He pulled up the trade-in record. He read something on the screen that made him pause. He didn't say anything. Brandon leaned over to see. He read it too. He straightened up and looked at the old man across the counter with a different expression than he'd been wearing for the last 15 minutes. Jamie Delisle climbed down from his stepladder. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the front door of the store opened. Margaret Wellett was 54 years old and had owned Ridgemont Arms and Supply for 16 years. Before that, she'd been a sergeant in the Canadian Armed Forces 3PP CLI, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, with 2 tours that she never discussed at industry dinners but that had shaped the way she ran her store the way weather shapes stone, without announcement, permanently. She walked in carrying a flat white in one hand and a set of key fobs in the other, dressed in a fleece vest and work pants, her silver hair pulled straight back. She'd been at a supplier meeting in Owen Sound all morning and had driven back through the first hard snow of November, and she was in the mood to sit down and review the afternoon receipts and not talk to anyone for 20 minutes. She read the room in 4 seconds. The old man at the counter, the way Kyle was standing, the way Brandon was standing, the trade-in file open on the computer screen. She walked to the counter, set her coffee down, and looked at the screen herself. Then she looked at Harold Mercer. For a moment she just studied him. The canvas jacket, the hip lean, the way his hands rested on the edge of the counter, relaxed, flat, like someone who had learned a very long time ago not to telegraph a thing. She said, "Mr. Mercer." Harold looked at her. "I'm Margaret Wellett. I own this store." She paused. "I recognize your name from the registration paperwork. You sold us a Browning High Power 3 years ago. Matching numbers, 1944 production run. I still have it in the back. I've turned down 4 offers on it." Harold said nothing. She turned to Kyle. Her voice didn't change. It didn't need to. "Go pull the Browning from the safe. The one from the Mercer estate file." She caught herself. "From the Mercer file." Kyle went. She turned back to Harold. "Can I ask?" "The SP-01. Still looking for something beside the bed?" "My daughter's been after me about it." "Smart woman." She looked down at the counter and then back up. "The trade-in you're looking at. It came from a retired OPP officer out of Parry Sound. 18 years service, mostly rural. Took care of his equipment. The holster wear is even, which means he drew slow and reholstered careful." She picked it up, held it professionally. "It's a good choice for what you want. Heavy enough to feel certain, light enough not to matter at 4 in the morning when your hands are cold." Harold looked at her. "You seem to know what you're talking about," he said. "I was PP Seelai," she said simply. "Bosnia and Kandahar." She set the pistol down. "I know what it's like to want something reliable in a dark room and not want to think about it." There was a silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable. Kyle came back with the Browning in a case. He set it carefully on the counter in front of Harold and stepped back. Harold didn't open it immediately. He put one hand flat on the lid of the case and stood there for a moment. "My father's," he said. "I know," Margaret said. He opened it. The pistol lay in old oilcloth, the finish worn to silver at the edges of the grip, the numbers clear on the frame. He looked at it for a long time. "I sold it because I needed the money. 99 after the mill closed." He looked up. "I told myself I'd buy it back. It's been here," she said. "I never put it in the case out front. Didn't feel right." Harold looked at her. His eyes were the same grey they'd been all afternoon, but something had shifted in them, or maybe it was just the light. "What do you want for it?" he said. "What I paid for it," she said. "Whatever that was. My accountant has the number." Kyle had moved to the side of the counter. His arms were at his sides. He wasn't saying anything, and his expression had changed so completely from 40 minutes ago that it might have been a different face. Brandon was looking at the floor. Jamie, who had been standing near the back wall since coming down from the ladder, spoke for the first time all afternoon. "Sir," he said, "I want to apologize for—" "Don't," Margaret said quietly. She said it without looking at Jamie, and it was not unkind, but it was final. She looked at Harold. "They'll learn," she said, "or they won't work here." Harold picked up the Browning and held it the way you hold something that belonged to someone you loved. Carefully, with both hands, the weight of it separate from the weight of the object. "I'd like to take this one," he said, "and the SP01. "I'll write them both up," Margaret said. There was paperwork, and then there was more paperwork, because there always is, and Harold sat in the chair beside the front counter and filled it out with the deliberate handwriting of a man who had learned penmanship in an era when it was considered important. While he wrote, Margaret made a second coffee, offered him one, which he accepted, and stood behind the counter doing inventory. Kyle came over after a while. He stood beside the chair. He didn't crouch down, didn't make it theatrical. He just stood there until Harold looked up. "I was out of line earlier," Kyle said. Harold looked at him for a moment. Kyle's face was even, earnest, and clearly cost him something to hold that way. "Yes, you were," Harold said. "Not cruelly, just accurately. The gun handling, that wasn't. I didn't see it." "Most people don't," Harold said. He went back to the form for a moment, then set the pen down. "You know what I did before the mill?" Kyle shook his head. 22 years, Royal Canadian Regiment Sergeant. I did Cyprus twice, the Medak Pocket, and a short secondment near Kigali in '94 that nobody wanted to talk about afterward and still doesn't. Kyle was quiet. "I'm not telling you that to impress you," Harold said. "I'm telling you because when a man walks into your store, any man, you don't know what he's carrying, not in his jacket, in his body, in his years." He picked the pen back up. "Some of us are just quieter about it than others." Kyle nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Harold signed the form and handed it across the counter. Kyle took it and went to stand beside the computer and didn't say anything further, but didn't move away either, as though he was still in the presence of something he hadn't finished understanding. Margaret walked Harold out to his truck when everything was done. She carried one of the cases. He carried the other. The snow had picked up while they were inside, and it fell silently across the parking lot, the kind of snow that lands soft and disappears into the asphalt before it can settle. "The Medak Pocket," she said, as they loaded the cases into the back seat of his F-150. "2nd Battalion?" He looked at her. "I read everything I could find about it," she said. "After Kandahar, when I was trying to make sense of what we do." She paused. "There wasn't much public record. Still isn't." "No," he said, "there wasn't." She closed the truck door. The snow fell between them. "What you all did over there," she said, "at the Medak, that was real. It mattered, even if nobody said so at the time." Harold looked out across the parking lot, at the grey sky and the white ground and the strip mall signs lit up orange and blue in the early dark. "The thing about doing something that matters," he said, "is you don't usually know it while you're doing it. You're just cold and tired and trying to get your people home." She nodded. "My daughter thinks I'm lonely," he said. "Are you?" He thought about it. "Some days. Come back." "In the spring," she said. "I have a range out back, nothing fancy. But I shoot most Tuesday mornings. I wouldn't mind the company." He looked at her for a moment. She meant it plainly, the way soldiers mean things when they say them, without decoration, without asking for anything back. "I might do that," he said. He got in his truck. She stepped back onto the curb. He pulled out of the lot slowly, onto the highway into the snow. He didn't take the highway home. He took the back road along the water, the way he usually did in winter, when there was no traffic and the Georgian Bay was turning black under the cloud and the shoreline trees were bare and bent hard eastward, the way they always were by November, shaped permanently by decades of prevailing wind off the water. He drove with both hands on the wheel, the heater running, the 2 cases in the back seat. He thought about his father, about a Saturday afternoon when he was 11, on the back of their property in Simcoe County, shooting tin cans off a fence rail with the high power his father had carried home from Holland in 1945 without ever being asked to surrender it. His father had stood behind him with one hand light on his shoulder and said, "Steady," and he had been steady, and the can had flown, and his father had said, "Good," and that was all, and it had been enough. He thought about Kyle Arsenault, 26 years old, learning something in a gun store in November that he maybe hadn't had anyone to teach him before. He thought about Margaret Ellett, standing in the falling snow, talking about the Medak pocket like it mattered to her personally, because it did. He turned into his driveway and sat in the truck for a moment, after he shut it off. The snow was collecting on the windshield now, slowly erasing the view. He brought the cases inside and set them on the kitchen table. He put the kettle on. He stood at the window over the sink and watched the backyard disappear under white. After a while he went to the telephone, the landline still, because he'd never trusted the cell signal out here, and called his daughter. She answered on the second ring. "Dad? Everything okay?" "Fine," he said. "I got what I went for." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her kids in the background, some kind of disagreement about something, the way there always was. "Dad," she said, and her voice changed, the way it sometimes did in the evenings. "I wasn't trying to. I just worry. I know. You know I'm not trying to say you can't, Rachel." He said her name quietly. "I know. I've always known." She was quiet. "I'll put it in the lockbox on the nightstand," he said. "You can come check in the spring. Bring the kids, I'll teach them plant tomatoes." She laughed a little. "They're hopeless in the garden." So was I at their age. "Your grandmother fixed that." There was a pause, the good kind, the kind full of something that doesn't need to be said. "Okay, Dad," she said. "Spring, spring," he said. He hung up. The kettle began to whistle. He stood in his kitchen in Collingwood in November in the dark and the snow, and he didn't feel the shrapnel in his hip, or the years, or the things that don't make it onto any record. He just felt the house around him, solid and familiar, and the particular quiet of a man who has been carrying something a very long time, and has finally, today, allowed himself to be seen.